This is Lecture 32 in the series The ABCs of Communism. On this time we're talking about the Empire Strikes Back in Central America, specifically in El Salvador. And I had just finished talking about the prehistory and the colonial history of El Salvador in the previous lecture. So we're going to pick this one up with the 3 centuries of Ronin and Creole colonial rule from 1525 to 1821. During this colonial period, El Salvador was part of the Captaincy General of Guatemala, also known as the Kingdom of Guatemala, created by Spain in 1609 as an administrative division of New Spain. The Salvadoran territory was administered by the mayor of Sonsonate, with San Salvador being established as an intendancia in 1786. Creole rule was in El Salvador as it was throughout New Spain in the next 3 centuries. Master-slave and master-serf relationships of the Creole and Peninsular Spaniards over the surviving native peoples. The agricultural and mining economy being of the colonial latifundista type, requiring legal trade to be with Spain only. It was supplemented here and there by some entrepreneurial local endeavors in the manufacture of shipping and accoutrements. Smuggling to North American markets evolved naturally throughout this 300-year period. Likewise, there evolved a certain amount of Pacific Ocean piracy and privateering, as fortune would have it. Toward the end of 1811, the upheaval caused by the Bonapartists in Iberia motivated all the Central American ruling classes to perfect home rule by gaining independence from the Spanish crown. The most important internal factors were the desire of the local ruling classes to control their country's affairs free of Spanish authority. The Creoles' long-standing desire to avoid Spanish colonial trade and tax policy, as oppressive to them as British colonial trade and tax policy was to the North Americans, drove this aspiration for independence. In other words, the Creole ruling class of El Salvador, like the ruling classes in the USA and all of Latin America, wanted to trade freely with whomever and wherever they wished, and without Spanish royal tariffs in the case of Latin America, or without the British control of North America. The success of the French and North American revolutions and the weakening of the Spanish crown's military power as a result of the Napoleonic Wars made this possible for them. So they got it together, as they say, and they undertook the armed struggle for independence. In November 1811, the Salvadoran priest José Matias Delgado rang the bells of Iglesia La Merced in San Salvador. This was the call for insurrection. It was launched, and the 1811 independence movement in El Salvador was off and running. Although royalist troops suppressed this insurrection, and many of its leaders were jailed, another was launched in 1814. It too was beaten, but this process continued until in 1821 the Creoles won. The San Salvador would eventually become the capital of the nation of El Salvador. Now, one might wonder how these revolutionaries managed to survive, but the situation, they could not be killed as easily as common peasants and workers could be, because these were the sons and daughters of the of Spanish descent who were ruling there, and so they might get thrown into jail for a while. A few might get killed in combat, but most of them would survive, and so they kept launching revolt after revolt. In 1821, when Mexico broke away from the Spanish imperial system, then of course the rest of Latin America began to follow as well, and we have already talked about South America to some degree in that respect. But at any rate, so now the same thing has come to in 1821, success has come to the Creole ruling class uprisings in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, what we now call the Northern Triangle of Central America. The Spanish colonial authorities capitulated and signed the Act of Independence of Central America. Spain released all of the captaincy of Guatemala. At this time, this consisted of the current countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, as well as the Mexican state of Chiapas. Freed of Spanish rule, these former colonial territories declared their national independence. Then in 1821, El Salvador joined Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua In a political union they named the Federal Republic of Central America. However, this only lasted a year, and in 1822 the authorities of the newly independent Central American Federal Republic, meeting in Guatemala City, voted to join the newly constituted First Mexican Empire under Agustín de Iturbide. Only the Creole rulers of El Salvador resisted, insisting on autonomy. An Iturbide Mexican military detachment marched to San Salvador and suppressed the native Creoles. However, with the fall of Iturbide in March of 1823, his army decamped and returned to Mexico. Shortly thereafter, in 1823, the authorities of the provinces revoked the vote for joining Iturbide's Mexican Empire, and in its place they formed the Federal Republic of Central America out of the 5 remaining provinces, as Chiapas departed permanently to join Mexico in whatever form. Then the Federal Republic of Central America dissolved in 1841. El Salvador maintained its own government until it joined Honduras and Nicaragua in 1896 to form the Greater Republic of Central America. In turn, that republic dissolved in 1898. After the mid-1800s, the Salvadoran economy was based on coffee growing. As the world market for indigo withered away, the economy prospered or suffered as the world coffee price fluctuated. The enormous profits that coffee yielded as a monoculture export served as an impetus for the concentration of land into the hands of an El Salvadoran oligarchy of just a few families, and the U.S. imperialist United Fruit Company, with whom they were hand-in-glove compradors. Throughout the last half of the 1800s, there were a succession of presidents from the ranks of the Salvadoran oligarchy. Both conservative and liberal parties agreed on the promotion of coffee as the predominant cash crop. Both parties pursued the development of railroads and port facilities in support of the United Fruit Company, trade in fruit and coffee. They liquidated indigenous communal land holdings to facilitate the agricultural production of United Fruit. Then they passed de facto enslavement laws against Indians called anti-vagrancy laws. By this it was meant that native peoples not engaged as workers in mines or plantations were lazy, good-for-nothing vagrants who would inevitably become a public charge if they persisted in unemployment. No legitimate consideration was given to the idea that these people might prefer to follow a traditional way of earning a living rather than to be wage slaves. Now, with the anti-vagrancy law, United Fruit would have legal prison slave labor formed from the displaced campesinos and, in fact, all rural dwellers. This denial of autochthonous people's rights to pursue whatever way of life they preferred provided slave labor for coffee and fruit plantations. The people thus suppressed revolted in 1912. The oligarchy did its bid, creating the National Guard as a rural police force, attacking and massacring workers. From 1898 forward, we have the rule of the modern oligarchy and United Fruit. In 1898, General Tomás Regalado gained power by force, deposing Rafael Antonio Guterres and ruling as president until 1903. Once in office, he revived the practice of designating presidential successors. After serving his term, Regalado remained active in the army of El Salvador and was killed July 11, 1906, in the Battle of El Jicaro during a war against Guatemala. The progressive Araujo oligarchy family took his place. They had long been agitating for a leadership role. Specifically, power was handed to the intellectual lawyer Dr. Manuel Enrique Araujo. Until 1913, El Salvador was, therefore, politically stable, although there were undercurrents that the majority of the oligarchic families were seething in discontent. The problem for them was the 10-cent per day wage cap of the oligarchy, which they considered exorbitantly generous for 16 hours and no perks whatsoever. The then president, Dr. Manuel Enrique Araujo, thought that there should be some provision for workers injured on plantations, which the oligarchy said would just encourage always cheating workers to fake injuries so as to be paid for not working. He wanted the same workers' compensation for the highly dangerous mining jobs as well, where mine workers were known to be the worst sort of malingerers. He even wanted some public education. Well, such obvious communist nonsense meant to the oligarchy that he had to be killed, and so he was murdered in 1913. The oligarchy and the United Fruit Company agreed to form a new dictatorship featuring the far more sensible Melendez-Quinones family in charge, and their dynasty lasted from 1913 to 1927. In its latter years, their rule was bossed by Pio Romero Bosque, a former minister of government and a trusted collaborator of the dynasty. With Romero Bosque's passing, the oligarchy United Fruit rule was passed to another oligarchy family, the Melendezes, namely to Jorge Melendez. Melendez was president from 1927 to 1931. Free elections proven to be a bad idea. In 1930, Melendez announced free elections. Perhaps that had been a mistake, the rulers decided. Why? Because in the event, another Araujo was elected on March 1st, 1931, and he was just as bad as the last Araujo from the standpoint of the oligarchy. The guy, Manuel Enrique Araujo, they had had to kill, you'll recall, in 1913. Now, Arturo Araujo was promising reforms for the mass of Salvadoran plantation workers, and this is why he got elected. This was the country's first freely contested election, and it proved to be a lesson finally learned that such elections are not a very good idea. Once Arturo Araujo was elected president in 1931, Farabundo Martí returned to El Salvador. He came with Alfonso Luna and Mario Zapata. They began the real revolutionary movement that was immediately targeted by Martinez's fascist army. Thus, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front was an embryo born in combat as it responded to ruling class violence with worker-farmer violence. This was the beginning of the Civil War in El Salvador that would last for over half a century. Accordingly, this new Araujo government had lasted only 9 months, and in 1932, the oligarchy, and most importantly the United Fruit Company, decided such enlightened nonsense was more than they were prepared to accept, and used junior military officers to stage a coup d'etat. They accused Araujo's Labor Party of lacking political and governmental experience and of using its government offices inefficiently. Furthermore, Araujo made the mistake of not paying the army regular soldiers as part of his ill-thought-out campaign to discipline the military to his rule. The army's discontent at not having been paid by President Araujo for some months turned out to be fatal to his democratic ambitions. Therefore, the labor faker was thrown out in a color revolution. Underlying all this was that President Araujo faced general popular discontent as the people realized after electing him that he was just another labor faker, and their expected economic reforms and the redistribution of land had been just bullshit. The oligarchy organized demonstrations in front of the National Palace from the first week of his administration. And these spread as the masses realized that they had indeed been tricked. Now there was a popular base for a coup. The U.S. ambassador agreed with United Fruit and the oligarchy that enough was enough of this Bolshevik nonsense, which is what they considered it to be, and the plot was set into motion. This was an early color revolution, the kind that the U.S. rulers would revert to using after the defeat and destruction of their conscript army in Vietnam. The Vice President and Minister of War, General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, commanded the 1st Regiment of Infantry at the National Palace in downtown San Salvador. Since only the 1st Regiment of Cavalry and the National Police defended the presidency, they were the only ones that had to be bought. The National Police were placed on the oligarchy's payroll, and they changed sides. Later that night, after hours of negotiating, the army changed sides. Rodolfo Duque is the Honduran equivalent of China's Big Erdu and Spain's Juan March. The succeeding military directorate, composed of army officers, hid behind a shadowy figure. He was the rich anti-communist banker named Rodolfo Duque. Duque later installed the ardent fascist General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez as president of the republic. Martinez was the Chiang Kai-shek, or Francisco Franco, of Honduras. Araujo fled the National Palace. He later unsuccessfully tried to organize forces to defeat the revolt. The U.S. ambassador in El Salvador, however, met with the directorate and gave his imprimatur by recognizing the government of Hernandez Martinez, who he praised for restoring order. Martinez did his bid and agreed to put a gringo democratic facade on his dictatorship and thus to hold presidential elections. He resigned in 1934, 6 months before the presidential elections, in order to run for the presidency himself, leaving the government to his junta. He won the election, not a difficult achievement, as he was the only candidate. Democracy jackboot style. Martinez then ruled democratically, his second term running from 35 to 39. After another election, his third term ran from 39 to 43. He began a fourth term in 1944, but resigned in May after a general strike. Martinez had said he was going to respect the Constitution, which stipulated he could not be reelected, but what a surprise, he did not keep his promise. The modern revolution. In December 1930, El Salvador was at the height of the country's economic and social depression. Farabundo Martí, exiled due to his popularity among the nation's poor, and rumors of his upcoming nomination for president the following year, would return in 1931. The Communist Party of El Salvador, Partido Comunista de El Salvador, was recognized by the Comintern as the official Communist Party in El Salvador, and Miguel Marmol was its first secretary in 1931. The origin of the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. From December of 1931, the year of the coup in which Martinez came to power, there was brutal suppression of the rural resistance. The most notable event was the February 1932 Salvadoran farmer and enslaved peasant uprising. This uprising was led by Farabundo Martí and Abel Cuenca, and university students Alfonso Luna and Mario Zapata. These leaders were murdered before the uprising, except for Cuenca, who survived. After the murders, the insurrection erupted full-blown. The uprising evolved into a guerrilla war of indigenous farmers, and the government gave them little choice but armed resistance, as it had begun mass killing of over 30,000 people of what was to have been a peaceful meeting in 1932. Beginning at the famous La Matanza, which means the slaughter, the government slaughtered peaceful protesters and insurgent fighters alike. Tens of thousands of uninvolved peasant slaves and serfs died, the orders coming from President Martinez. The peasant uprising against Martinez, having turned into armed struggle, retreated into the mountain 10 days after it had begun. From 1932 to 1960, under Latifundista, United Fruit Company, El Salvador was ruled. The Communist Party led the ongoing rebellion from the mountain base areas. The United Fruit Company, the CIA, and the Latifundistas ruled the cities and the plantations. Periodic economic collapse caused by collapsing coffee prices enlarged the mass base for the broad mass resistance now known as the Farabundo Martí Front. Homeless but free would-be farmers seized unused or underused land. 130,000 Salvadorans who had been forcibly expelled from or who had fled from fascist Honduras soon joined them. Founding the Communist Party of Central America. The communist and revolutionary leader Farabundo Martí helped Marmol found the Communist Party of Central America. They led a communist alternative to the bourgeois Red Cross they called International Red Aid. Red Aid's mission was to perform humanitarian missions, as did the capitalist Red Cross, with the eventual goal of helping poor and underprivileged Salvadorans via education in dialectical and historical materialism. With the science of society and history at their disposal, Marxist-Leninist theory would make them free. This was the theory of International Red Aid, which also spread throughout South America. And we have mentioned before with regard to the Peruvian leader. But at any rate, the bourgeoisie from 1916 to 1979 ruled El Salvador through the Christian Democratic Party, PDC, and the National Conciliation Party, PCN. These were active in Latifundista Salvadoran politics, as I say, from 1960 until 2011. The fascist Supreme Court disbanded them in 1979 because the oligarchy and the U.S. CIA wanted nothing but outright military dictatorship. Both parties have since been reconstituted, and they share common anti-working class ideas. One represents the non-oligarchic middle class, and the latter the interests of the Salvadoran latifundistas, the United Fruit Company, the CIA, and their military apparatus. Historically, the high Salvadoran population density has contributed to tensions with neighboring Honduras, as enslaved Salvadorans escaped, emigrating to Honduras. The Salvadoran Civil War proper that we're familiar with begins in 1979 and lasts until 1992. In October 1979, a coup d'etat brought the revolutionary government junta to power. It nationalized most non-oligarchic companies and took over virtually all small farmer-owned land. The purpose of the new junta was to stop the revolutionary movement already underway. The oligarchy opposed agrarian reform, and the junta, formed with army officers such as General Majano and General Gutierrez, did as bid. Still dissatisfied, the oligarchy soon dissolved this junta because of its failure to effectively liquidate the people fighting for unionization rights, agrarian reform, better wages, accessible health care, not to mention freedom of expression. In the meantime, the guerrilla movement was spreading to all sectors of Salvadoran society as more people began to see that the oligarchy CIA dictatorship was fundamentally against their interests. In other words, all the non-oligarchy bourgeoisie were starting to realize that their best interest lay with liberation forces, even if they were communist-led. The Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front expands, and middle and high school students were organized in MERS, M-E-R-S. In English, that means Revolutionary Movement of High School Students. University students were involved with AGEUS, that is AGEUS, the Association of Salvadoran College Students, and workers were organized into the BPR, the Popular Revolutionary Bloc. By 1979, death squads were killing about 10 people every day. In October 1980, Fidel Castro and the leadership of the Cuban rebel base sent the DGI, that's the General Direction of Intelligence in Cuba, to the defense of the Salvadoran people, working to unify the 5 guerrilla groups of the Salvadoran left. Accordingly, these groups were formed into the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or FMLN. FLM now had 8,000 regular soldiers and hundreds of thousands of part-time militia, supporters, and sympathizers. So as the regular army loses troops or decides to expand with new army units, it pulls them out of irregularly organized hundreds of thousands of people in the part-time militia. Well, let's take a quick flashback on how the USA had organized and financed the 1979 junta. The gringo regime on the Potomac, as I like to call it, was terrified that the political situation in El Salvador was going the way the Cuban rebel base wanted it to go. The CIA called Napoleon Duarte from his exile in Venezuela, which they still controlled outright, to head this new El Salvadoran junta. However, the Salvadoran revolution was already unstoppable, and Duarte found his new role as head of the CIA-imposed junta almost impossible. He was unable to thwart the outcome of the national liberation struggle. Even the Catholic Church, long the steadfast bastion of reaction in El Salvador and all of Latin America, began to have second thoughts. Archbishop Romero of San Salvador denounced injustices and massacres committed against civilians by government forces. Although Romero was a willing accomplice and would-be savior of the bourgeoisie, he now fashioned himself as, quote, the voice of the voiceless, unquote. Accordingly, the CIA oligarchic bosses ordered his assassination by a death squad, while the prelate was saying Mass on 24th of March, 1980. The Salvadoran Civil War, 1979-92, was becoming more than just a conflict between the CIA latifundista dictatorship against the Communist Party. Now the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, FMLN, was getting bigger and broader. Why? Because the CIA oligarchy coup on October 15, 1979 featured the dictatorship slaughtering non-communist protesters as well as communists. This effectively enlarged the scope of the Civil War to totally unmanageable levels for the gringo latifundista dictatorship. In short, in January 1980, The Cuban rebel base agents had managed to get the left-wing political organizations united to form the Coordinated Revolutionaries of the Masses, CRM. A few months later, these left-wing armed groups united to form the Unified Revolutionary Directorate, DRU. It was the reborn FMLN, and it merged with the Communist Party in October of 1980. Full-fledged civil war lasted nearly 13 years and saw extreme violence in the form of deliberate terrorizing and targeting of civilians by CIA-organized death squads. An unknown number of people disappeared during the conflict, and the United Nations reports that more than 75,000 were killed. The United States provided all the military equipment for the fascist government of El Salvador to conduct this war against its own people during the Carter and Reagan administrations. In 1990, the UN began peace negotiations, and on January 16, 1992, the combatants in Mexico City formally ended the conflict, signed a final agreement, the Chapultepec Peace Agreement. However, the magnitude of this final solution civil war requires a close-up view of what happened in the 13 years of vicious civil war. A civil war the reactionary class enemies of socialism in El Salvador and their CIA allies are attempting to reignite today in 2015. Inside the Civil War. El Salvador, as we have seen, is the second smallest country in Central America after Belize. As with all the Central American colonies of U.S. imperialism, it was characterized by the most stark class inequality. In the late 1800s, coffee became a major cash crop for El Salvador, bringing in approximately 95% of the country's income. However, this income was restricted to only 2% of the population, sharply dividing the people between a small, powerful ruling class elite and an impoverished majority. Class struggles grew through the 1920s and were exacerbated by the drop in coffee prices following the worldwide stock market crash of 1929. 1961 to 1964, top-secret internal State Department documents outline the Gringo plot against El Salvador, and I list these documents. I won't bother reading them all to you here. They're in the book, and when you get it, if you want to, you can look up each one of them and see exactly what the contents are. But as you might imagine, they describe in great detail how the State Department wants things to occur in El Salvador. To summarize, the beginning of July 14, 1969, an armed conflict erupted between El Salvador and Honduras over immigration disputes caused by the Honduran land reform laws. This conflict lasted only 4 days. We discussed it in the last lecture, but it had long-term major effects for Salvadoran society. Trade was disrupted between El Salvador and Honduras, causing tremendous economic damage to both nations. An estimated 300,000 Salvadorans were displaced due to battle, many of whom were exiled from Honduras. The Salvadoran government would not meet their needs. Instead, the fascist regime in San Salvador opted to kill them. The regime strengthened the power of the military in El Salvador and encouraged corruption, ensuring the loyalty of the officer corps. In the years following the 4-day war, the government not only increased military spending, but expanded purchases of weaponry from Israel, then fascist Brazil, West Germany, and the United States. It was trying to overwhelm the popular forces at home in a campaign of torture and death. The 1973 world oil crisis had led to rising food prices and decreased agricultural output. This worsened the extant gross class inequality in the country, leading to increased resistance. President Arturo Armando Molina pretended to initiate a series of land reform measures calling for land large holdings to be redistributed among the peasant population. The reforms, being fake, were soon seen to be, and the landed ruling class elite had gained time to improve the position of their death squads to slaughter the mass of working people. The rise of Orden, O-R-D-E-N. On 20 February 1977, General Carlos Humberto Romero, representing the National Reconciliation Party, PCN, defeated the Revolutionary Party of Democratic Unification, UNO, in elections. These phony elections had been marred by blatant fraud and voter intimidation. A new government paramilitary force called Orden, in capital letters, O-R-D-E-N, carried out intimidation. Orden specialized in intimidating everyone, and in this case voters, with machetes. The period between the election and the formal inauguration of General Humberto Romero on 1st of July 1977 was greeted by massive protests from the popular movement, which were met by government thugs of the Orden variety. On the 28th of February 1977, a crowd of political demonstrators gathered in downtown San Salvador to protest the electoral fraud. Orden arrived on the scene and opened fire, resulting in a massacre, as they indiscriminately killed demonstrators and bystanders alike. Estimates of the number of civilians killed exceed 1,500. President Molina, following his CIA script, blamed the protests on foreign communists and immediately exiled top UNO party members from the country. Vicious attacks on the social movement continued after the inauguration of President Romero, as his new government declared a state of siege and suspended civil liberties. In the countryside, the latifundistas, dissatisfied with Orden, organized and funded their own paramilitary death squads, among them the infamous Regalados Armed Forces, FAR, led by Hector Regalado. The rise of Blowtorch Bob. These death squads were soon incorporated into El Salvador's military intelligence service, ANSESAL, A-N-S-E-S-A-L, in capital letters, led by Major Roberto Dalbosón. He was the U.S. CIA and State Department's hand-picked favorite golden boy for El Salvador. He became the most crucial operator of the U.S. Comprador state apparatus, murdering thousands of union leaders, activists, students, and teachers suspected of sympathizing with the left. He got his nickname of Blowtorch Bob from his addiction to the use of the acetylene blowtorch in the torturing of prisoners. The Socorro Jurídico Cristiano, or Christian Legal Assistance, a legal aid office within the Archbishop's office and El Salvador's leading human rights group at the time, documented the killing of 687 civilians by government forces in 1978. The same organization documented 1,796 killed in 1979. The oppression prompted many in the Catholic Church to denounce the government, and the government responded by arresting and torturing Catholic clerics. Coup d'etat, oppression, and insurrection from 1979 to 1981. Humberto Romero out. With tensions mounting and the country on the verge of an insurrection, the U.S. created the Civil Military Revolutionary Government Junta JRG, and deposed President General Carlos Humberto Romero in a coup on October 15, 1979. The United States had organized the coup because it was frightened by the recent overthrow of the Somoza regime in Nicaragua, and because the FMLN was gaining in the war. It decided that Blowtorch Bob should be given the position as chief of the El Salvador dictatorship, and they would soon get him. Washington embraced the new junta with military equipment and cash. In 1980 alone, the United States allocated $5.7 million to the Salvadoran military in order to prevent at all costs another Nicaragua. Wishing to project a prettier image, the JRG pretended to enact a nominal land reform, but it nationalized non-oligarchy land and non-U.S. banks, non-oligarchy coffee and sugar plantations, and scheduled elections for February of 1982. It even pretended to disband the paramilitary private death squad Orden on November 6th of 79. However, this order was soon rescinded, as were all the fake measures that had a seemingly progressive nature. Naturally, these sops to the social movement had encountered strong resistance from the military and the wealthy latifundistas, who got what they wanted, which was a legal outright fascist dictatorship. This triggered increased protests from the masses, demanding that the government address their needs. All three civilian members of the junta resigned on January 3, 1980, along with 10 of the 11 cabinet ministers. On January 22, 1980, the Salvadoran National Guard attacked a massive peaceful demonstration, killing up to 50 people and wounding hundreds more. Before Blowtorch Bob, however, Jose Napoleon Duarte was to be put forward. Duarte became a member of the junta on March 9, 1980, as he had agreed to lead an intensification of death squad activities and government repression. As we mentioned, coming in to try and save the regime by putting a prettier face on it was Archbishop Oscar Romero. In February 1980, Archbishop Romero published an open letter to U.S. President Jimmy Carter in which he pleaded with him to suspend the United States' ongoing program of military aid to the Salvadoran regime. He advised Carter that political power is in the hands of the armed forces. They know only how to repress the people and defend the interests of the Salvadoran oligarchy. Romero warned that U.S. support would only sharpen the injustice and repression against the organizations of the people which repeatedly have been struggling to gain respect for their fundamental human rights, unquote. Accordingly, the CIA and its compradors agreed that Romero had to go, and on 24 March 1980, they assassinated the Archbishop while he was celebrating Mass. The final trigger for them had occurred the day before, when Romero called upon Salvadoran soldiers and security force members to refuse their orders to kill Salvadoran civilians. President Jimmy Carter stated that this was a quote, shocking and unconscionable act, unquote. At Romero's funeral a week later, a government-sponsored snipers in the National Palace and on the periphery of the Gerardo Barrios Plaza shot 42 of the mourners. Enough is enough. It's time for Blowtorch Bob. The rapist. Bob's new job might have been permanently derailed by an incident that now placed him in the national spotlight. It turns out that one of Blowtorch Bob d'Aubisson's hobbies was the capture and raping of young women from well-to-do bourgeois families. He had tired of raping peasant and factory girls and was always on the lookout for one of these privileged youngsters. On May 7, 1980, he captured a young lady whose name need not be further sullied here. When she eventually escaped and returned home, she told her mother what had happened. The shocked mother told her husband. The enraged burgher got his friends together, and using the information his daughter had provided his wife, the vigilantes found the farmhouse that had been the site of this infamy. There, on that same day, they found former Army Major Robert d'Aubisson, and they arrested him and his cohorts for rape. The disgruntled bourgeois vigilantes found Blowtorch Bob, along with his conspirators, civilians, and soldiers, in possession of documents connecting Blowtorch Bob and these guys as the organizers and financiers of the shooters who killed Archbishop Romero. Naturally, this part got into the press. Furthermore, the vigilantes had found documents outlining a plotting for a coup d'etat against the JRG. That is the current fascist regime in El Salvador at that time. Their arrest provoked right-wing terrorist threats and forced the JRG to release d'Aubisson. The CIA's golden boy was beyond the reach of law, especially for such a minor infraction as committed daily by the Gringo gang in El Salvador's U.S. Embassy. The vigilantes made the mistake of not killing Bob, and for this they would eventually pay with their lives. In 1993, a UN investigation confirmed that d'Aubisson had indeed ordered the Romero assassination. In addition to vicious violence against the social movement in the cities, rural violence against agricultural workers and their families began to escalate. A week after the arrest of Roberto d'Aubisson, the National Guard and the newly reorganized paramilitary Orden, with the cooperation of the Army of Honduras, carried out another large massacre at the Sumpul River on May 14, 1980, in which they killed at least 600 civilians, mostly women and children. Escaping villagers were prevented from crossing the river by the Honduran armed forces and then killed by Salvadoran troops who fired on them in cold blood. Over the course of 1980, the Salvadoran Army, Orden, and three main security forces, the National Guard, National Police, and Treasury Police, killed at least 11,895 people. Their targets were peasant farmers, trade unionists, teachers, students, journalists, human rights advocates, priests, and other prominent demographics among the popular movement. Human rights organizations judged the Salvadoran government to have among the world's worst human rights records in this hemisphere, which is saying a lot considering what the U.S. had already imposed in so many countries of Latin America. The U.S. State Department later justified U.S. arming of the fascist regime in El Salvador, stating, quote, "The immediate goal of the Salvadoran Army and Security Forces and of the United States in 1980 was to prevent a takeover by the leftist-led guerrillas and their allied political organizations. At this point of the Salvadoran conflict, the latter which were much more important than the former," unquote. The military resources of the rebels had their greatest strength by far, and that lay not in the force of arms, but in their mass organizations. These popular force organizations were made up of labor unions, student and peasant organizations that could mobilize thousands of the citizenry. The rebel base in Cuba did what it could to come to the defense of the Salvadoran people by shipping weapons and experienced fighters to assist in their use and the training of the patriotic forces. As the war progressed, El Salvador's major cities could be paralyzed, and the countryside shut down the country through strikes. In Gringolandia, there were critics of the U.S. military involvement, charging that, quote, "it legitimated what has become dictatorial violence." They said that political power in El Salvador lies only with fascist generals in government positions who practice a policy of reform by oppression, unquote. A prominent Catholic spokesman insisted that, quote, "any military aid you send to El Salvador ends up in the hands of military and paramilitary rightist gangs who are themselves at the root of the problems of the country," unquote. The murder of the Maryknoll sisters. On December 2, 1980s, members of the Salvadoran National Guard raped and murdered 4 USA nuns and a laywoman. Maryknoll missionary nuns Mara Clark, Ita Ford, and Ursuline nun Dorothy Cazell, and laywoman Jean Donovan were on a Catholic relief mission providing food, shelter, transport, medical care, and burial to death squad victims. U.S. military aid was briefly cut off in response to the murders, but would be renewed within 6 weeks. I knew one of these women personally. She had been an assistant at one time to Sister Anna at the Lurigancho prison where I had been held, and for that reason I now got involved in the investigation of the El Salvador matter, as did my wife, who had had contact with her when I was inside. Sister Anna in Peru had come to my attention for the good work she did for the poor inmates in Cross Lurigancho, which was the name of the federal penitentiary I was in, as I have described in volumes 5 and 6 of my series Idaho Smith Search for the Foundation, which you can get in some libraries in printed edition or from Kindle books in ebook form. I admired her for her selfless dedication and constant sacrifice on the behalf of the downtrodden inmates. I could tell you a lot of stories about this woman, but the most amazing thing to me was she dressed very plainly in a long, simple dress and came to that prison every day to take care of these guys who nobody else was interested in. And I'd had contact with her for a variety of reasons, off and on, over the couple years I was there. So I got to know her pretty well and realized that she's one of these truly saintly kind of people you read about, but very rarely run into. Well, anyway, although back in the saddle, Gringolandia meets new resistance, the 1981 insurrection. As government violence increased, previously non-militant political groups metamorphosed into guerrilla forces. In May of 1980, the Salvadoran Revolutionary Leadership met in Havana, and it formed a consolidated political military command which soon morphed into the now reborn Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, FMLN, honoring insurgent hero Farabundo Martí, who we've already discussed several times, killed by the National Guard in 1932. The FMLN immediately announced plans for an insurrection against the government, which now began on 10 January 81 with the FMLN's first major attack. The attack established FMLN control of most of Morazan and Chalatenango departments for the war's duration. Attacks were launched on military targets throughout the country, leaving hundreds of enemy thugs dead. In addition, the outgoing Carter administration increased military aid to the Salvadoran armed forces to $10 million, including $5 million in rifles, ammunition, grenades, and helicopters. In justifying these arms shipments, the administration claimed that the regime had taken, quote, positive steps, unquote, to investigate the murder of the 4 American nuns. This was a blatant lie, as even U.S. Ambassador Robert E. White said that he could find no evidence that the junta was conducting a serious investigation. At any rate, you can see that Washington is determined to support this fascist dictatorship and to encourage it in every possible way, no matter how many civilians they kill, even U.S. nationals. During the same month, the JRG strengthened the state of siege, initially imposed by President Carlos Alberto Romero in May of '79. Now the fascist junta went all the way, declaring martial law and adopting a new set of curfew regulations. Between January 12th and February 19th, 1981, 168 persons were killed by the thug forces just for violating curfew. Vietnam tactics applied. In its effort to defeat the insurgency, the Salvadoran armed forces carried out a scorched earth strategy, adopting tactics similar to those being employed by the CIA counterinsurgency in neighboring Guatemala. These tactics were primarily derived and adapted from U.S. strategy during the Vietnam War and taught by USA military advisors. An integral part of the Salvadoran Army's counterinsurgency strategy entailed, quote, draining the sea, unquote, or, quote, drying up the ocean, unquote. That is, eliminating the insurgency by eradicating its support base in the countryside. The primary target was the civilian population, displacing them in order to remove any possible base of support for the rebels. The concept of draining the sea had its basis in a doctrine by Mao Zedong that emphasized that the guerrilla must move amongst the people as a fish swims in the sea. Eric Nair, the executive director of America's Watch, wrote in a review of 1984, quote, "This may be an effective strategy for winning the war. It is, however, a strategy that involves the use of terror tactics, bombings, strafings, shellings, and occasionally massacres of civilians," unquote. Beginning in 1983, guerrilla strongholds were located by U.S. reconnaissance planes, and then they relayed this intelligence to the Salvadoran Army. The slaughter of civilians in rural areas resulted in the displacement of large portions of the rural populace as survivors fled. Of those who fled or were displaced, some 20,000 resided in makeshift refugee centers on the Honduran border in conditions of poverty, starvation, and disease. The Army and death squads forced many of them to flee to the United States, but there most were denied asylum. On January 17th to 18th, 1981, a U.S. congressional delegation submitted a report to Congress after visiting the country. That delegation concluded, quote, "The Salvadoran method of drying up the ocean is to eliminate entire villages from the map, to isolate the guerrillas and deny them any rural base off which they can feed," unquote. In 1981, the government's systematic use of terror tactics and violence against the civilian population escalated, and the Army and so-called security forces killed 16,000 civilians in total over the course of the year that they admitted to. In its 1981 report, Amnesty International identified, quote, "regular security and military units as responsible for widespread torture, mutilation, and killings of non-combatant civilians from all sectors of Salvadoran society," unquote. The report also stated that the killing of civilians by state security forces became increasingly systematic, with the implementation of more methodical killing strategies, which allegedly included use of a meatpacking plant to dispose of human remains. Between August 20th and August 25th, 1981, 83 decapitations were reported. A death squad using a guillotine did the murders. In late 1981, The Atlacatl Battalion, organized in 1980 at the U.S. Army School of Americas in Panama, was sent into the Morazan Department in the northeastern part of the country, a major stronghold for the FMLN. On December 11, 1981, the Atlacatl Battalion occupied the village of El Mozote and massacred at least 1,000 unarmed civilians. In the El Mozote massacre, the Atlacatl soldiers accused the adults of collaborating with the guerrillas. The field commander said they were under orders to kill everyone, including the children, who he asserted, quote, would just grow up to become guerrillas if we let them live. We are going to make an example of these people, unquote, he said. As details became more widely known, the event became recognized as one of the worst atrocities of the Salvadoran government against its own people, although by this time you can see this is just run-of-the-mill activity for this fascist regime. Interim government and continued violence, 1982 to 84. In 1982, the FMLN demanded a peace settlement that would establish a government of broad participation. The Reagan administration countered by saying the FMLN wanted to create a communist dictatorship. So-called elections were to be held in an atmosphere of intimidation by thug paramilitary attacks, so the FMLN called for a boycott. El Salvador's National Federation of Lawyers, which represented all of the country's bar associations, refused to participate in drafting the 1982 electoral law. The lawyers said that the elections could not possibly be free and fair during a state of siege that suspended all basic rights and freedoms. Falling out among U.S. Nazi coalition of Reichsführers. Pursuant with measures put in place by the JRG on October 18, 1979, elections for an interim government were held on April 29, 1982. The Legislative Assembly voted on 3 candidates nominated by the armed forces. Alvaro Alfredo Magaña Borja, leader of Democratic Action, was elected by 36 votes to 17. As such, he was ahead of Blowtorch Bob's National Republican Alliance, ARENA, A-R-E-N-A, and the Party of National Conciliation candidate. This time, the Nazi bosses fell out among themselves. All 3 U.S. imposed, as Blowtorch Bob, Roberto Dalbazon, accused Jaime Abdul Gutierrez Avellano of imposing on the Assembly, quote, his personal decision to put Magaña Borja in the presidency, unquote, in spite of what he called a categorical no from the ARENA deputies. Magaña was sworn into office on the 2nd of May. In Decree Number 6 of the National Assembly suspended Phase 3 of the implementation of the agrarian reform as a sop to the ARENA. So there wasn't any agrarian reform at all. The Apanenka Pact was signed on 3 August 1982, established a government of national unity whose objective was to put a prettier face on the fascist dictatorship. No substantive changes from being made during Magaña's presidency. The CIA demanded that the Salvadoran Nazi bosses behave in an at least as unified manner as the communist leaders. The Civil War further stoked by the USA. The communist-led liberation struggle is unstoppable. The FMLN continued fighting. The government continued its violence against the people. The FMLN attacked the Ilopango Air Force Base, destroying 6 of the Air Force's 14 U.S.-provided Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopters, 5 of their 18 Dassault Ouragan aircraft, and 3 of its U.S.-provided C-47s. The FLM Army stepped up the fighting on its main fronts against the U.S. oligarchy dictatorship, so that between February and April of 1982 there were 439 armed confrontations and 782 more between January and September 1982. The United States Embassy Secret War Report to Washington estimated the damage to the economic infrastructure at $98 million. The FMLN also carried out large-scale operations in the capital city and temporarily occupied urban centers in the country's interior. The size of the rebel army rose to at least 9,000 regulars, backed up by several hundred thousand irregular militia reservists. The gringo bosses, headed by General Alexander Haig, were tearing their hair out. The end. Systemic, massive, and widespread atrocities by the Salvadoran army and private thug forces continued during the period of the so-called interim government. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights reported that on May 24th of 82, a clandestine cemetery containing the corpses of 150 disappeared persons was discovered near the Puerto del Diablo, Panchimalco, less than 8 miles from San Salvador. The war was closing in on the capital. In fact, the U.S. had lost, as the Salvadoran Nazis hunkered down for the encirclement of their Berlin, as Somoza had 3 years earlier in his El Bunker in Managua. On June 10th, 82, 4,000 Salvadoran Nazi troops carried out a cleanup operation in the rebel-controlled Chalatenango province, where they murdered 600 civilians. The Salvadoran field commander acknowledged that an unknown number of civilian rebel sympathizers were killed while declaring the operation a success. But the last-ditch U.S. Nazi stand could not stop the rebel army's final offensive. The final phase of the war came in the capital city 19 days later, when the army massacred 27 unarmed civilians during house raids in a San Salvador neighborhood. The women were raped and murdered, everyone was dragged from their homes into the street, and then executed. The operation was a success, said the Salvadoran Defense Ministry. The communique went further to say that this action was a result of training and professionalization of our officers and soldiers. During 82 and 83, government forces killed at least 8,000 civilians a year. Targeted executions as well as indiscriminate killing Vietnam style remained the main policy of the Army and Thug police forces. Well, I can see that our red light is blinking here, so I'm going to have to stop this, and we'll continue it in the next one, and then we're going to go on to discuss a much more pleasant situation, and that is the way the Empire strikes back against Nicaragua, which of course they eventually lost, and the Sandinistas took power again in Nicaragua and retain it to this very day and will for a long time to come. And of course we now have the Chinese Canal going through Nicaragua, which is going to make it the wealthiest country in Central America. At any rate, I'm going to stop here. I think you can see what a terrible situation developed in El Salvador as far as the mass of people are concerned. You can see that the Communist Party led the successful fight against U.S.-imposed fascism on El Salvador, and we'll summarize the conclusion of this whole thing in the next lecture. And at that point, I think we will conclude for today.